This is Michael Herrera, CEO, MHA Consulting. And again, I welcome you today to our webinar, Your New BFFs, Compliance and Residual Risk. You know, compliance has been around forever as well as residual risk, but again, it's not used in many or majority of the business continuity and disaster recovery programs we work with, and things that we've been trying to implement through our tools and our methodology and our approaches, how important it is to know how compliant you are as well as what is my residual risk. Because these two put together give you immense value as you move forward in your business continuity program. So if we could also as well, could everyone please make sure you mute yourself in the background? Thank you. All right, let's go ahead. I'm Michael Herrera again with MHA Consulting. MHA has been in business now for 19 years. We have an average We have a comprehensive suite of services. We have a diverse global client base, which I'll show in a second. And more importantly, over time, we've developed a number of tools which helps us evaluate compliance, residual risk, as well as conduct business impact analysis as well. We have a very diverse global client base that over the 19 years we've been able to work with. As you can see, we're not in a specific vertical. We've worked across many different verticals. And as you can well imagine, some, again, are very good at business continuity, disaster recovery. Others are still attempting to get to that level. Some check the box. And as we all know, each company is different. What we do see is a tremendous change over time with the need for business continuity. And I would say in the last 2 years, we're starting to see more of the smaller and mid-sized companies that are getting a lot of pressure from their clients and their customers to have business continuity and disaster recovery. So we're starting to see a number of changes. As you can well imagine, who's leading from a business continuity perspective? Financial institutions are always the leaders in how well they do it, and more importantly, can they execute? Those still lagging are healthcare, which is kind of sad. And again, healthcare, of course, is critical as it is from a hospital perspective, but still, they're finally starting to learn how critical business continuity is, as well as disaster recovery, and education as well. They were also lagging, but are also making changes. So we're starting to see changes in different environments and as to who believes they need to have business continuity, as well as those that are finally starting to get on board and starting to generate good, solid business continuity programs. So MHA, we provide, I'm not going to spend a lot of time with this, we provide end-to-end services from assessing your current environment to developing your strategies to creating your response and recovery plan to, very importantly, testing it and making sure it's executable, and then overall maintaining improvement. So a full continuum of business continuity services from end to end. And again, we've developed and implemented these over 19 years of having MHA in existence. Okay, compliance. Let's talk about compliance. Many places I go, it's amazing. I'll always ask, have you adopted a standard? Do you know your level of compliance? And most of the time you will just get a blank look as to, one, what are you talking about? And what standard are you also talking about that I need to adopt? And I will tell you, as we see now in the new BCM compliance environment, especially now you see GDPR, you see other very stringent legislation regulations that are really coming to bear in many different industries, that they're going to now start to require business continuity measures, not just to be in place, but more importantly, verifiable. And I'm going to tell you, too many business programs we run across, they're not verifiable. You may have the documentation in place, but are they truly executable? And what we'll see today is whether it's auditing, whether it's regulators, people are really wanting to say, can you execute, can you not, and it's verifiable. And what we're finding through the regulators, the auditors, and the customers, and number two here, is guess what? They're becoming sophisticated. They know what they're looking for. They're not just using a checklist, you know, and they're not afraid anymore to show up on site, say, can I take a look at what you have? And let's verify that what you can do is what you say you can do. So we see that as well. Also, number three, what we see, especially at MHA, as we do current state assessments, and when we complete them and we go talk to senior management and or board of directors, management is highly aware now that guess what? They're being held to higher levels of accountability. And there's nothing more that really distresses senior management is when you ask them to actually attest to the capability of their business continuity program. And you ask them, who on the senior level team is going to sign off that the business continuity program is executable? You'll be amazed how that gets shifted around the room. So one, we see stringent legislation, regulations, and standards, now making sure programs are verifiable. We have sophisticated regulators, auditors, and customers that are really knowing what to ask and really want to see what you have documented and executable. And then management is also now understanding, hey, I really got to attest to this and really make sure that this does work if something happens. And then lastly, we see this with a lot of the non-regulated businesses. We get a lot of calls now, like we're saying, small to mid-size, even large companies that are saying, hey, I have customers, I have suppliers, people trying to make sure I have business continuity in place. What's it going to take? So it's not just non-regulated, which is a good thing, because I think overall we're going to see a higher level of readiness and executable programs overall in this country, as across the world as well. So what is compliance? Well, being compliant is being in a state of accordance with established standards, guidelines, and directives. Really, I look at that, all of those standards, guidelines, and directives, really, I see it as a fitness program for business continuity. It's a way to outline through a solid set of guidelines and directives and steps and actions to make sure that my program can be the fittest. So what are some of the things we look at when we take a look at compliance? Well, do we have good management and oversight, policies and standards? What's our methodology and approach, our documentation? And when we're looking at those, taking all those items into consideration, what are we actually going to evaluate? Well, how good do I administer my program? How good is my crisis communications, crisis incident management, my IT disaster recovery, my business recovery, my supply chain risk? So by being in compliance, you're going to look at a lot of different areas. You're going to look at how good is that infrastructure, and is it well aligned with what the best practices say we should be aligned with. A lot of people don't realize these industry standards, guidelines, and directives, guess what? It is the perfect cookbook. It's already been designed for you. Use that to build the infrastructure and framework of your program, which will then definitely lead to higher performing. That's one thing we've seen in our compliance confidence tool. And those subscribers that have solid levels of compliance, they have very high performing programs. So you're aligned with standards, you're typically going to have a higher performing program than those that aren't and have a high level of compliance. So what's the output of us evaluating compliance? Well, how aligned or not aligned are we with standards? Are we in good shape or not? And more importantly, does this framework that I built in place, does it provide for recoverability or not? So one of the things that we use in our tool is a very simple dial. So as we evaluate compliance amongst all of these areas, whether it's administration of the program, crisis management, disaster recovery, business recovery, we score it. So we typically say 0 to 60, guess what? We have a lot of issues with our compliance or alignment with standards. 61 to 79, we're starting to eliminate a lot of those big gaps. We're starting to see some level of compliance in our framework and our infrastructure starting to operate properly. And then we always, of course, want to be in that 81 to 100, which basically means I'm down to those small number of items that, guess what, I may not even try to resolve them because they're so minimal from a compliance or alignment perspective. So that's a key thing. When we're all doing this, we want to see basically where we're at, what's our level of health. So first question I always ask, and every class I've taught in the last 3 years, I have been asking, how many of you have adopted a standard? And I'll give you, in my last class, I had 105. We were talking about the BIA from an IT perspective. I bet 105, 110, and less than 10% had formally adopted a standard. It's not surprising. Most programs you go to, they have no idea from a compliance perspective and what a standard to adopt, as well as what are they even looking at residual risk. There's a lot of different standards out there. For everything from ISO 22301, which replaced BS 2599, ISO 27031, which is on the IT side, which is big, which is a big item currently, especially with the GDPR, Federal Financial Institution Examination Council, which is truly the gold standard from a business continuity perspective. Some of our clients that aren't even banks are starting to use FFIEC, and their whole perspective is, I would rather be as compliant as I can with the most difficult standard, which to us then means we're doing a good job. NFPA 1600, which is National Fire Protection Act 1600, that is an excellent standard. This standard came after 9/11. I highly recommend it. It's free, it's thorough, it provides an outstanding framework for you how to develop your program and to make sure it's in line with industry standards and guidelines. NIST 800, which is more on the IT side, National Institute Standards of Technology 800, more for IT, another solid government-based standard. So you can see we have a number of others, BCI good practices. We have some for fire, which is OSHA Part 29. There is a multitude of standards. Here's the interesting piece that I'll always state. The majority of these standards are similar. They ask the same questions. They may ask it a little bit differently, but they're all basically the same. They're all trying to, some are more strategic than others. ISO 22301 is a little bit more strategic versus NFPA, which gets down to another granular level. So a lot of good standards out there for you to use. Some are free, like I mentioned, NFPA 1600, FFI EC. Others, of course, charge, such as ISO and BCI good practices, but they're all out there for you to use. All I ask you is adopt a standard. Pick one. If you're not regulated, pick one that makes sense for you. Okay, so how do I measure compliance? Now, for example, like MHA, we have our BCM metrics tools to measure compliance, but there's no reason you can't measure compliance on your own. So first and foremost, adopt a standard. And if you adopt a standard and you're formally going to do it, you better put that in your policy that you're adopting it. Most people are afraid to do that because then now they're held accountable to that standard. So if you're going to do it, take it seriously. Figure out which standard works for you, whether you're regulated or non-regulated industry. Pick one that makes sense, adopt it, and then go out and figure out, look at that standard. Look at it and look at the different areas it's asking you to evaluate. And very simply be able to score it. What's my level of compliance with these questions? Do some questions, are they more important than others? Set some sort of weighting for each question and then measure my level of compliance. And in the end, be able to come out with a score, such as 0 to 60 or 61 to 80, 80 to 100. Come up with a simple way to score it. It's not that difficult. We used to do all of our compliance scoring using an Excel spreadsheet. So it's easy to do. Take some time. One of the things that I see with most people is they just don't want to take the time to do this. It takes time, but the first time you do it from the point on, then you can see where were we and where are we at today. So once you adopt that standard, you go out and figure out a simple way. Look at each question, weight it, and then score your level of compliance to come up with a percentage score. Establish that baseline. Where are we? Once you set that baseline, boy, it's much easier. You can then just move on and say, okay, now how do I get better? So I'm going to evaluate myself again. How often are people evaluating compliance? Most of the programs that we work on that are new, most people are evaluating themselves every 3 months. Those that are mature or very mature typically will evaluate themselves every 6 months or even just once a year because not much has changed. But again, you're new, you're trying to see where you're at, how you can improve your program. Typically, most people are doing it every quarter because, again, they're making lots of changes, trying to improve. Those that have some level of maturity or higher levels are either every 6 months to every year. Based off that baseline and how we scored, whether you scored good or you did not score good in different areas, you can then start to generate a roadmap for improvement. Because now I know where my framework is good. Maybe I don't need to spend the time and resources and money in other areas that I need to. So that roadmap for improvement becomes very important because now you know where to pinpoint and know where your heat areas are, those that have the highest concerns that I've got to really put the right resources, time, and money to. Now, here's the thing we see a lot of times. People will go through this, they'll generate a roadmap, and guess what? They don't commit to the end state. So you don't utilize their roadmap. They don't follow it. They don't make adjustments to it. You come back again to measure where they were, not much has changed. And then you see others who commit to that end state and goal, and you see the dramatic difference they make. Now, very important when you generate that roadmap for improvement, make sure that roadmap and that time frame works for you. Don't set unrealistic time frames. That's really key. A number of our clients who have done exceedingly well, they set very realistic time frames, and it may take longer, but guess what? They get it done. We see the improvement in their level of compliance and alignment. So continue to measure those efforts and outcomes, and you continue to set that right direction. If only I could get more business continuity programs to at least measure their level of compliance and have a roadmap. We see so many groups now, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people in the business continuity group. No roadmap, no idea how compliant or non-compliant their program is. Now, when I get 6, 7, 8 people, I'm probably talking close to $1 million in salaries and benefits. I've got all these people with no direction, no idea what's good, what's bad, and what needs to be worked on, and what direction we're taking. That's a lot of money to have out there, and people just doing whatever willy-nilly versus we have a very specific direction to go. That's why compliance is so important as well. All right, reporting on the forest. This is something that drives me crazy. Again, we'll go to a number of programs. What are most people only measuring? They're measuring here what's on the left. How many plans they have, the last BIAs, test dates, training dates. Did somebody file an exception because they couldn't, again, test this year or update their plan on time? But does this really tell me where I'm at? Does this really tell me anything other than it just gives me volumes of information or volumes of plans that I was handling? What I really want to be able to do is do what the forest, not the trees. I really want to understand, how good am I from a performance and compliance perspective? My risk, am I ready? Can I execute? And my level of maturity overall, how am I doing? My return on investment. That's what we really want to get to. Yet I see so many people just tracking the trees. Hey, I have 47 plans and I did X number of BIAs. Doesn't really tell me much. It gives me what you're doing, but doesn't say if it's good or bad. So when you want to report in the forest, being able to come to management and say, hey, here's how the forest looks. Program administration, hey, we're doing pretty good. I can tell you that we're at least in mid around 70 here. Crisis management, we're doing really good, 80 to 100. You know what, I may not have to put as much resources and time. Business recovery, we need to work on. There's some big areas here we still see. We'd like to get to 80. IT disaster recovery, a big problem. So you can start to see by being able to report on the forest, you're able to give management that real quick heat indicator, where we're good, where we're not, what needs to be worked on, and then be able to say then below that high level score, here's specifically where there's areas of help. Within disaster recovery, we scored so low. Well, which of the areas do we really need to work on? Well, guess what? We're not doing any recovery exercises. Also, our change management for disaster recovery is very poor. So there's all of these areas we need to work on. How do I get that score to where I need it to be? Where do I need to put more of my time? So it's very helpful knowing not just the overall forest, what's good in that forest, and then be able to drop down to those areas that aren't good, and knowing then where to pinpoint my resources. This takes time. It takes effort. But again, the return on investment to you, your team, and your management is great over time. So when we go through, analyze where we're at, score our level of compliance with whatever standard we adopt, we then need to figure out that roadmap. And again, going back to those 2 slides I just showed that showed you areas that were good and areas that were bad, how do I then generate a roadmap for improvement? Because the score is more than just a score. I may scored 64, but what does 64 really mean? Well, first I've got to look at that area and where I scored 64 and say, all right, are there areas in that 64 score that I received that really don't need help? Everything is good. They're close to 80 to 100, or they're high enough that we don't want to touch it. Then send focus on which areas have high priority. Those areas that we have little to no compliance that are critical to the program that I've got to fix. And then thirdly, on those items that maybe have moderate priority, such as, you know, they're not as critical and they still have low to no, but those are the next areas of priority. So this gives you a way to look at those, analyze those results, take that score to another level and say, what do I really need to focus on in that score that I just got in that area? And try to figure out, why am I not achieving compliance? Do I don't have the right policy in place? Standards? Do I not have enough resources? Knowledge? Do I need some additional people or people even from the outside to help me? And then be able to produce an action set of action items and be able to prioritize that for management. So you can see, just by assessing compliance, you're bringing a whole nother level of focus to your program. You're able to tell management what's good, what's bad, and as well as then, more importantly, say, here's the roadmap I know we need in order to build a much stronger framework, which leads to a high level of recoverability. Because that's what it all ends up, right? Higher level of recoverability. That's what we want. Okay, so that was compliance. So compliance is one piece of it. Again, how well we're aligned with standards, best practices, directives, etc. Now we're looking at residual risk. Residual risk, boy, I wish compliance was used as much as I'd like it to. Residual risk is even used less. So what is residual risk? So residual risk has been around forever. Residual risk is the risk that remains after all efforts have been made to identify and eliminate the risks. So if you take a look at, for example, NASA launching a rocket, their job before the rocket launches is, have we eliminated as many of the risks and concerns we have? And there's going to be some risks and concerns that just can't be eliminated, they need to accept. But they try to do everything through all the controls to mitigate that. Well, it's the same thing in our business continuity programs, right? This really comes down to game time execution. How good are all our controls in our plans, and are they all solid to make sure that we're maximizing the potential for success? So here's some concepts that over time you'll need to understand with residual risk. One is inherent risk, is what is that risk associated with that particular business recovery plan and that business unit or that IT disaster recovery plan that we're looking at? How critical? What's the inherent risk associated with that? Is it a critical to our organization so that if it is disrupted, we have a significant inherent risk? Number two, risk tolerance. Big item here. How many people really understand risk tolerance and risk appetite? Risk tolerance is as simple as me saying, would you like a $10,000 deductible or $5,000 deductible on your car? And it's really interesting when you tell people that, they'll say, oh yeah, I'm a safe driver, I'm willing to take the $5,000. Then you ask them, do you have the $5,000 in the bank to back that up? And it'll amazing people's risk tolerance of 5,000 suddenly changes to the most I'm willing to accept is 2,500. So risk tolerance versus risk appetite are two different things. You'll find people will have a higher risk tolerance, but when it comes to risk appetite, it'll typically be lower after they analyze it and think about it. Mitigating controls. These are all those controls we have in place to minimize our risk and our inherent risk. So and I'll go over these in a second, but for our business recovery plans or IT disaster recovery plans, our mitigating controls are our business impact analysis, our recovery strategies, our recovery exercises, all of those controls we have in place for each plan that make it operate at a higher level. And then what remains after all of this is the residual risk. So what will end up happening is once management sets the tolerance, we know what the inherent risk of that particular area that we're measuring. We take a look at our controls, how good or not so good they are. Whatever's remaining after we subtract and do all the calculations is what we have as our residual risk. And we hope it's within management's tolerance. We either meet it or we exceed it. We like to measure residual risk at the recovery plan level. Here's why. By us measuring it at the business or IT recovery plan level, I can then easily roll this up from a recovery time objective perspective to a building perspective to a region perspective. I can basically tell you overall where my risk is. What level is it based on management's tolerance? So I know we're within tolerance and not within tolerance. So that's really important. So again, in the end, this is what it all comes down to, because by measuring the residual risk, we get to know really where are we able to execute, are we not? This is just a simple graph that comes out of our tool, but it's something you could generate as well. By risk tolerance of each of your RTOs, you can really tell management, be able to drill down which plans are within management's risk tolerance, which plans are outside of that. This begins to show management specifically where does the greatest risk lie in our program. And I'm going to tell you where it is in the programs we've measured. When we measure health of plans, it typically lies in two areas. It lies in recovery strategies, because when we measure and look at recovery strategies, most times we find most people have not fully implemented a recovery strategy that can meet or exceed the recovery time objective. The second piece is recovery exercises. Whether it's business or IT, very few organizations are testing to the highest level when it comes to recovery exercise, which again increases the risk. So those two areas, I would say, a lot of times we find people have good BIAs, they have good plans, they've taken care of maintenance, they have the team, but when it comes to those two areas, not doing well, and again, increases the risk. So here's how we overall measure risk. Again, this is very in a simplistic approach here. There's more calculations that go beyond that, but I would recommend if you go out to the internet, there's ways that you can adapt the residual risk calculation to the things that, again, how we do it from a plan level. So like I stated earlier, we like to calculate residual risk for business and IT plans. For the critical business unit and IT recovery plans, we do it at the plan level. So we consider a number of things. We consider criticality factors, the threat landscape, risk tolerance, and mitigating controls. So those are the areas that we like to consider. Criticality factors being its RTO, the threat landscape being where is this? Does this business unit reside in an area that has a high threat landscape? For example, is it in downtown New York City versus it being in the middle of Idaho somewhere? We have to consider our threat landscape because that's very important to the inherent risk. So based on its criticality factor, which is its RTO, multiplied by its threat landscape, that gives us the inherent risk of that specific item that we're measuring. And then, of course, risk tolerance / appetite is what management is willing to accept for that specific segment of those areas that we're measuring. Typically, how we like to measure risk tolerance or appetite is by RTO category, inherent risk category. So those that have a very high level of inherent risk will ask management what's the level of risk tolerance / appetite you're willing to accept, and then so forth and so on. And then, of course, we already talked about mitigating controls, which I'll cover in a second. So basically, by assessing residual risk in your recovery plans, you're going to identify how bulletproof and capable each plan is. Because again, if management has a very low tolerance, very low appetite for risk, but all your mitigating controls are also operating at the highest levels, you're going to meet or exceed their tolerance, which is excellent, which means your plan is highly capable. Versus if all those controls are very weak, again, you're going to have a plan that, guess what? It's not bulletproof. It's got problems. So what we typically like to do with residual risk is, again, we tell people, just take time to only measure those, again, that have the highest inherent risk to your organization. If you have 100 of them, you probably don't need to measure all 100 plans that you have. Measure those with the highest risk to your organization. So we kind of already talked about these different criteria, from criticality factor, which is typically the RTO, the threat landscape, high, medium, or low, depending on where does this business unit or IT recovery plan sit, and inherent risk, which is the combination of those two, and then management's overall risk tolerance / appetite. So these criteria are all taken into place, taken into account. And here's the mitigating controls we look at each plan. How good is its BIA? We measure it 1 to 5. Its recovery strategy 1 to 5, 1 being weak, 5 being excellent. Same thing for all of these different areas. One area that also is very weak today that we see is third-party supplier risk. A lot of plans don't take that into account, aren't able to deal with it, so that renders their plan, again, to have significant risks. Okay, now here's the real world when you come to measure residual risk. Now, when we go out there and try to talk to management, even when you talk sometimes to enterprise risk, they don't understand residual risk. So you need to, you yourself, if a planner, if you want to implement residual risk, one, make sure you have a good understanding of it. And two, make sure that when you go out, you need to educate management as to what does residual risk mean and how does it impact business continuity? Why do you want to measure it? So important that they understand that. As soon as you start to tell them that, guess what, I'm going to be able to more effectively use resources, time, and money, that's typically will help you sell residual risk. The second part is really getting management to understand risk appetite versus risk tolerance, as we talked about. Most people are willing to have a higher risk appetite till you really explain it to them, and then their risk tolerance gets a lot lower, and that's what you really want to get to. What's the maximum risk we really want to take, okay? So management, for example, if they have a level of tolerance that's higher or lower for risk, that's going to impact your program and its requirements. If they have a lower tolerance for risk, you're going to have to have tighter controls in place. That typically is going to require more time, money, resources, etc., and vice versa. If they're willing to accept more risk, your controls don't have to be as good. Now, tolerance for risk can be adjusted on the level of inherent risk. So let's say out of 100, 30 of those plans that we looked at are really critical. Well, most likely management's tolerance for risk on those most critical ones should, again, be much lower than the remainder. So you're then able to adjust your level of controls based on what's the inherent risk to our organization, which again means better use of time, money, resources, and strategies. Very, very important. Now, higher threat landscapes. So for example, if you are in New York City, San Francisco, your other areas where you could have, or you're geographically in areas that have terrorist activity, etc., those higher threat landscapes are going to impact your inherent risk. That's why you see a lot of organizations today trying and doing their best to move their organizations to areas of lower threat landscapes. Very, very important. So this is an actual example, or this is a sample of assessing plan residual risk. And like we were saying, how do we actually do it? So if you take a look, well, here's the name of the plan, where it is, what building does it reside in, who the owners are, for example. What's the risk factor? So based on our calculations and based on its RTO, its threat landscape, we came up with the risk factor that it's catastrophic to the organization should it be impacted. What's our risk appetite or tolerance? For this inherent risk, management had set for this segment or group of 10% or very low. The risk appetite / tolerance is very low, which means our controls have to be at a very high level. Threat landscape, based on where it's at, it's in a high level of concern, has a high threat. So multiply the risk tolerance, the appetite that we came up overall with the risk factor that's, again, catastrophic. By looking at the different controls in this plan, we scored them 1 to 5. And in our scoring, 1 to 5 is very defined. 1, we have, this is all, again, aligned with standards. We basically know what 1 means all the way to 5, which is best practice. So you can see we measured every one of these. We looked at the controls within the plan, and out of it came a score that said my residual risk was high, and it was outside the tolerance. So right now, this tells me that this plan needs to be worked on. There's areas you can see yourself. Recovery strategy is average. Our recovery exercises are below average. All of these areas are weighted by importance. So we know which one of these are weighted more importantly than the others. So that's really important because over time you can then go back to management and say, I really need to fix recovery exercises and recovery strategy overall because we weighted those as high and those are critical to our controls, and we see that as a common thread across our organization. So you start to see, as you start to look at individual as well as overall plans, you get a very clear picture. Where are my exposures? I see so many people spending tons of time on BIAs, on plans, yet very little time on making sure the recovery strategies really work, and we're doing more than just desktop or tabletop exercises. That's what it all comes down to. Those are the ones that we got to focus on so we can be executable. Okay, how do I leverage all this? So over time, as I measure compliance, it's very important I take a look at where was I. So for example, let's say I measured my 17 score, 2017, and now in 2018, you can see, boy, my score really improved. I want to make sure that I continually track my compliance and my residual risk progress. Most people will measure compliance once, or will come in as a firm, measure it. They don't call us back for 2, 3, 4 years. And I'm saying, well, what happened in between first time we came and then? Why aren't you continually measuring it, knowing where you're at, updating your roadmap? It's proven if you do this and you set the roadmap and you get things done, you will see improvement. And it doesn't mean that you need a 7-figure BCM budget to make that happen. We have clients that have much smaller budgets, but by following their roadmap, knowing where their gaps are, they make great progress, and they make it in a sooner amount of time, and they're able to have programs that actually work. Same thing with you measuring your residual risk. Has my residual risk been reduced? Do I have more plans within tolerance versus outside of tolerance in all of my RTOs? Am I starting to have better recovery strategies, higher levels of recovery exercises? Am I handling my third-party supplier risk better? So as you can see, I'm now able to tell management, I have a framework that's aligned with standards, which means I'm following the right cookbook instructions, and B, I'm minimizing my risk. So overall, I'm giving you higher return or value on investment. That's what it's really got to come down to in the end, being able to go back to management and say, you know what you're paying me, I'm doing a great job. I have high compliance, low residual risk, program is good. That's really important. Versus just telling him, I've got 100 plans, he or she, I've got 100 plans, 200 BIAs done, versus telling him compliance, residual risk. So out of both of these numbers, so important, not just understanding compliance, residual risk, I can now have a very strategic and tactical level roadmap. I now know really where I need to pinpoint and really work at and generate this roadmap at least 12 months to 24 months out that specifically state here's the deliverables and tasks in order to further heighten compliance and further minimize my risk. I wish I could just go to most organizations and say, show me that roadmap, and everybody could throw one out and say, this is where I'm at. This again also makes sure everybody that's working for you in your BCM office is doing the right things, and you're all working towards that higher compliance, lower residual risk. So overall, by combining these two, you're able to really basically tell me what BCM value are you bringing the organization? What's my value in investment or return on investment? So important. So high compliance, low residual risk, you're bringing me a good return or value on my investment in business continuity. These two numbers are excellent to have in place. It may not be perfect when you first start to measure these, but over time, as your level of sophistication increases and improves, again, Matt, and you're able now to take this enterprise risk and also show them, hey, I've done a good job. We're doing a good job if something happens. Our company's ready, and more importantly, it can execute. That's what it all comes down to. And you can actually, over time, reduce the net cost of your program. Let me give you a great example. I've seen some IT organizations that go off on their own. They go off and create wonderful DR strategies. Here's the problem. Once you measure residual risk and you begin to understand what's management's tolerance, has IT gone too much? Have they tried to protect too much of the organization with too much money? Have they exceeded the tolerance that management has, the risk tolerance? So many times they'll say you're overprotecting things. You could have reduced the net cost of the program. Same thing with your recovery strategies for your business units. So you got to use this in many different ways. That's all I had today. I'm going to open it up for questions. I know I covered that quick.